We are. I'm joined today not by Roy Anderson. Maya is joining me today. Roy Anderson had an event that he needed to attend to, so we're just going to move forward with the Next Gen Procurement Cost podcast and talk about how supplier management has changed and what is important about supplier management now and in the future. And
Absolutely.
with me is Maya. She's going to be moderating the session today. First, though, if you guys want to put in the chat where you guys are joining us from and anything you want to know about supplier management in the chat, that'd be fantastic, and we can deal with that as it comes. So today we're going to essentially look through the agenda. So we're going to talk about how supplier management has evolved since it started probably back 30, 40 years ago, and then how we can use SRM, supplier relationship management, as a strategy to bring sort of procurement and procurement strategy into the forefront of SRM. So with that, we can just jump right in.
All right, absolutely. So we'll go ahead and get to topic one. And the first thing that we want to talk about is where SRM is at today. You did a great job of chatting to me about this, so I'm excited to get into it. So if you can go through, like, what are the basic activities of SRM when you're thinking about supply relationship management, and how do you see that reflected in what most organizations are doing today?
Well, so when I started in procurement a long, long time ago, we always talked about supplier relationship management as a necessary thing to do. But as procurement is not really the most funded department in most organizations, it usually fell to the back of the line as things were prioritized. So what ended up happening was that regulators told us we needed to do something. And those typically became the things that sort of to keep us out of jail type things. So if you think about Sarbanes-Oxley coming in, and then you would have the Enron failure happen. And so then you had folks coming in to say, look, you need to evaluate people's financial or suppliers' financial stability. You need to evaluate their control environments. And more things now have piled into that as organizations have more, let's call them woke boards, for example, to say now you need to make sure you hire diverse folks. You need to make sure you have diverse suppliers. You need to make sure that they aren't hiring slaves. You need to make sure they're not polluting. You need to make sure, like, all those things are sort of adding to it. But let's be honest, like, none of those things are very decision making, and they're very rarely strategic. They're reactionary in ways. So essentially, when I get engaged to help folks implement supply relationship management program, more often than not, they're very focused on the tactical stay out of jail type things. And, if you're lucky, you start talking about making sure KPIs are met and so on and so forth. But it's not really the strategic stuff that we sort of dream about. So that's kind of where we are today. Obviously there are outliers on either side of that equation, but most organizations, when they think about SRM, it's still sort of on the risk and get stay out of jail frameworks.
I like stay out of jail. That's definitely important. So we definitely want to keep that done and dusted. But let's talk a little bit about moving from just those tactical need to haves into the more strategic parts of SRM.
Absolutely. And I think it's very fascinating how we sort of get into contracts and supply relationship with the best of intentions, right? So if you think about the tactical pieces and parts of it, so yeah, you have a contract. The contract has KPIs. You may even done a risk assessment when you started. And the issue very quickly becomes that there's no real mechanism to ensure that those things are actually done correctly and done regularly and they add value. So even if, let's say, you say that a supplier needs to send you a certificate of insurance and an updated SOC 2, very seldomly does that get followed up on and sort of enforced. And that's the minimal thing to do to sort of stay out of jail, as we talked about, right? But then how then are these suppliers that you're picking, and I'm talking about the strategic suppliers, like how are they aligned with developing the future of your corporate strategy? How are they delivering against your corporate strategy? And how can you get them to sort of go above the tactical day-to-day stuff and bring things to the fore maybe sometimes before things happen or as things are happening. And it was interesting. I was working in procurement for a large insurance company, and you had claims adjusters that would come to us and say, "Hey, by the way, there's this new technology now called, mobile phones, where you can take pictures of cars and accidents, and we can use that to predetermine whether or not, this or that, the other thing is required." And that strategic, like that, really shortened down the claims adjustment process. And those are the types of things that really changes the value of that particular service. And those are the types of relationships that you want. So a couple of things, right? You want to get them to bring innovations to you before they bring it to anyone else, but they also want to figure out, like, how can they warn you about failures before that becomes apparent, right? And it's it's what you call a gauge versus an idiot light, right? When the idiot lights on your car comes on, it's too late. You probably need some sort of early warning system to make sure that things are surfaced as and when it happens, rather than after it's too late. So that's really ultimately where you want to switch from the tactical of just checking boxes to sort of becoming value added and solving issues together with your most strategic providers.
I love it. And I don't know, it seems so obvious, but when you really think about it, your supplier is going to be your procurement's the expert on your organization. Your supplier is the expert on whatever it is they're supplying. So working with your most strategic suppliers to hear what their innovations are, of course, mobile phones, brand spanking new one, very exciting. But neat. Awesome. So that was great going through both. So we're going to move on now and take a look at internal alignment. And we have this really interesting conversation about making sure procurement's actually aligned with the needs of your internal stakeholders, because you can be doing wonderful work, but if it's not what they really want or need, they're not all that impressed with you. And that was interesting to me. Can you kind of get into that and that conversation we had?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting. So I worked for a bunch of different companies, and I worked for some very large companies where the balance sheet was so large that they didn't care about saving money. It was all about optimizing the balance sheet. So, me coming in as at that point, 20-year procurement person, it was all about saving money, right? And I was told very bluntly, like, we don't care. Right? We care about speed. We care about innovation. We care about this or that, the other thing. So it's usually you have to have the internal alignment with stakeholders, so you know that you're providing the value that they're looking for, and that manifests itself not just in sourcing but also in how you manage your providers, right? So we're used to the typical playbook of saying reduce cost, all those kinds of things, but it could be that number one, you need to make sure you ensure supply, make sure that the things that you are required to have are actually there when you need them, right? And sometimes that costs more money, but that's okay. And innovations is more important than, say, cost or volume, those kinds of things. So it's making sure that you, as a procurement professional, understands what your customers want internally, and then you can give that message to the suppliers, right? As the custodian of the process from beginning to end. And the other thing is you should also ask your suppliers, right? Is what are your best customers doing in this field, to make sure you can bring that information back to your customers. And just by doing that, you can immediately add value, because those are the guys that need to make the decisions to do something or not do something. So the whole idea of breaking down those closer loops between procurement and the supplier and procurement and the stakeholder, it needs to be sort of a team effort to make sure things are done the right way for the right reasons, for the benefit of the enterprise, not necessarily for the individual pieces of the organization.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And not to jump the gun, but our next episode 3, is going to be a little bit more about how procurement can build those really strategic and hopefully pretty close relationships with their stakeholders. So you're definitely going to want to pre-register for that one, because that's relevant here. All right, and let's get a little bit deeper into how teams can actually evaluate their current SRM. So kind of looking in the mirror, seeing where we're at now, and identifying those opportunities to find more strategic leverage.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a very interesting part. So first of all, has the supplier management or supplier onboarding process ever made you make you change your mind? And basically, let's say a supplier comes in and they have piss poor financial health, and they don't have a controlled environment, all those kinds of things. will the stakeholders ultimately override you and still say, yeah, we don't care, we're moving on with that? If that is the typical modus operandi, like, are you really strategic? And it was interesting. I was working for a bank on the East Coast where the marketing department picked a supplier to do some mobile app stuff. And we looked into the organization. It was two guys, and they were basically, working Amazon style in the garage at the beginning. We were just like, well, is this really what you want to sink a couple $100,000 into? You want to prepay them for those kinds of things. All the warning bells are there that you're paying for something before you get it. And they said, no, we're going to do this to the right folks. And I got voted off the island. And lo and behold, less than 3 months later, that company was acquired, which was good. But the acquiring party basically said, yeah, we're not honoring that contract. It's a silly contract to begin with. So basically we're left standing. So sometimes we need to learn those lessons the hard way. And the irony is they still didn't learn the lesson. They would have done it anyway. But anyway, I sort of move on, right? The second question around evaluation of your existing program is, do you actually do what you say you're going to do? Are you tracking performance? And you don't have to track performance of every contract, but if the contracts are really important to you, then you should be tracking performance. You should be tracking how quickly you're paying them, how quickly they're responding to issues, how happy the customers are, and those kinds of things. And if you're not doing it, you can start small and start with the most important things. But if you're not doing it at all, you're probably not doing all that well in a maturity curve. The third is obviously, are you measuring outcomes? Are you measuring KPIs? And this is sometimes an interesting discussion because I've been part of very, very large outsourcing agreements, for example, where we debadged or rebadged like 10,000 employees. And we were, basically we took internal departments and made them external vendors, so to speak. And we had no clue how to measure the success of this because now you're paying invoices rather than salaries. And obviously the evolution of tracking activities or tracking outcomes and those kinds of things change over time. So as you're setting up a contract, sometimes you have actually no clue about what to measure and how to measure it. So it needs to be sort of a back and forth process as the relationship matures and goes on. But the whole idea here is KPIs are sometimes not as important as the outcomes you're seeking with the third party. So I think that is what you need to think about is you can meet the 99.9995 service level. Does it really matter in the grand scheme of things if you're not getting the outcomes that you want from using the solution, right? The fourth is, do suppliers validate the supplier performance? So again, if you are reporting the triple nines, quadruple nines, is that what folks are actually seeing? Is the lag time there? Is it not there? Are they actually delivering things on time? Is the data good? Those kinds of things. So the whole idea is, make sure that your constituents agree that things are done the right way if the supplier reports it as such, right? So you need to basically start shifting from, are we compliant, to are we getting what we want or what we thought we wanted from this relationship? And last but not least is there a tie between the executives of your organization and the executives of the supplier organization? So if something goes wrong, is there a line of communication that you can use for escalation if required, right? And we talked about this in a different episode, that sometimes the salespeople that are selling stuff that may not be there, or it may be over exaggerated of what the actual capabilities are. And then you sort of need to bring that up to flagpole to make sure that things get resolved. And, that's kind of important. So can you come to a mutual understanding if you need to be, and can you exit with your heads held high at the end of the day if something needs to happen? And these aren't always easy discussions to have, but there needs to be a very clear escalation path for existing relationships, because you don't want to have the first call between two executives be the introductory call at the same time as trying to solve a crisis, because that's not a good situation to be in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Those are great questions. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. We're going to talk a little bit about the second tier supplier challenge, another super, super interesting topic. So I'll let you jump into this one a little bit.
So we talk about this a lot, and very often now, again, if you're in the box checking exercise of supplier management, so as part of GDPR now, it's become required for people to sort of say, all right, Focal Point uses these third parties to deliver services, right? And then you decide, okay, are these companies like AWS and Microsoft? You're probably good to go there. And or then you sort of get into the middle tier. Let's call them maybe Monday.com or Asana. I'm not disparaging those companies at all, but they're not Microsoft or AWS. And then it's smaller companies like that. And the amount of scrutiny that you need to have with those suppliers, depending on what the supplier is doing for you, needs to be taken place of. And basically, again, your box checking exercises to make sure, like, are you comfortable with the third parties that are there that your suppliers are using? Now, what I always find interesting now, as I'm developing or as I'm working at Focal Point, is we're starting now to look at the combined risk of the third parties, so the second tier suppliers. And you realize there's a lot of concentration risk, for example, where you have a whole bunch of first tier suppliers that are using the same second tier suppliers. And all of a sudden you can see that, oh shit, I have the same 50 or 60 suppliers using the same, defense or security solution. Like if you think about CrowdStrike comes to mind, right? So if they're all using CrowdStrike and their supplier goes down, then you can have some real challenges with your first tier suppliers. And it's really understanding the connectivity between the second tier suppliers and the first tier suppliers. And really the whole idea of just even putting something simple in place to say, even though you don't have a relationship with, say, CrowdStrike, has there been a cyber event at the organization? Is there negative news or adverse media for that supplier? Those kinds of things. And it's a relatively easy thing to set up. And it's not going to mitigate the risk, but at least you're monitoring it, right? And the challenge always becomes, as you are onboarding new suppliers, are you doing that comparative analysis to say, okay, here is a second tier supplier. How frequently uses that supplier? Who owns the follow-up with that supplier, if any, and what can we do to mitigate it? So, for example, if somebody collected SOC 2s for that supplier, could you get it, evaluate it, so on and so forth? So the whole idea really is bringing the data together so you can actually make sense of it and evaluate it. And that's very hard when you think of onboarding a supplier and you don't keep track of your second tier suppliers in a joint database, right? Because if it's all there's a checkbox exercise, this supplier is good because the second tier suppliers also look good. That's valuable, but not sufficient to sort of look at the totality of the risk of second tier suppliers. And I think it's a huge problem, or it's a huge potential risk that most folks haven't really thought about yet.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember the first conversation about this we had, and I was like, my gosh, this is an entire huge new layer on this SRM onion. But absolutely, having the ability to actually get into your data and see what that means risk-wise is critical. And on that, I think we're going to get a little bit into kind of some functionalities within Focal Point that empower that level of visibility. So I'll go ahead and let you talk through these screenshots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we talked about all the strategic stuff, but now we're back to sort of the tactical stuff. So I apologize for that, right? So as you can see here, we're looking at the Focal Point screen, and you see here that Susan, aka Grover, has a lot of things that need to be done. She has a number of approvals that need to get done, and a bunch of tasks that need to get done. And we can automatically, when things are overdue and when things aren't being done as expediently and efficiently as possible, the solution can flag those things and send reminders and alerts to make sure that things are being done as and when needed, or escalated as and when needed. And I think that's one of those things that are typically missed, right? Supplier management is not always the most sexy thing in the world, but unless you actually follow things up internally, it's going to disparage the brand of SRM even more. So, again, fairly rudimentary, right? But at the end of the day, knowing where things are sitting in the pipeline and knowing who has the ball and what is waiting on are kind of important. And if you kind of move into the next thing, and this is, again, a SOC 2 type example, right? So here, and again, you can see here, we created a fictitious supplier called Supplier Cloud Player. And you can see here that the SOC 2, Susan has one of those things that needs to be done. So obviously this SOC 2 is coming up for renewal. And it's important to note that it expires in a few days, and you need to sort of follow up and make sure that Cloudflare uploads the new SOC 2 to make sure it stays compliant. And again, like, you can push responsibility internally to the stakeholders internally or to the suppliers, right? So that you can set up the workflow to do whatever it is that you want to do. If you want to send it to the supplier for the first swing, that's fine. Or if you want to send it to the stakeholder or procurement for the first swing, and they can do that direct connectivity between the supplier and the stakeholder, fine too. So then that's all good, well and good. Now here's the really cool thing if you go to the next slide. And that's the idea of automatically evaluating a SOC 2. So the SOC 2 that you see on the screen, actually it's not a SOC 2, it's a report of a SOC 2. And it's focal point SOC 2. So the first thing we have done here is we have created an AI agent to read through that entire SOC 2 and basically come up with, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly of every SOC 2. So it looks at exclusions, it looks at exceptions, it looks at all the control criteria and the tech service criteria, right? And you can see here, the top line of this is that this is an excellent report and has good controls. They are effective and they've tested, like, life is good, right? The report does not have any qualifications to it, meaning it's not unqualified. It is unqualified, meaning it's good. There's no sort of qualification statement to say it would have been good if. And so everything is good here, right? But it does flag that there are two potential items that you may want to follow up on. One is that AWS is carved out. It's probably okay, right? Because most people know AWS, but you can follow up with it right here from the screen, right? So the whole idea is using automation and AI to essentially automate the assessments for you, but then also coming up with potential follow-on items right there. So basically, do you want to follow up on that? Yes, I do. You click the button and it assigns it to somebody and it sort of takes off from there. And the idea really is bringing the information to you as and when needed before it becomes an issue. And typically, if you sort of send things to internal review for a SOC 2, it takes 2 to 3 hours if somebody looks at it and reads it stem to stern. And through the magic of AI, you can have it now scanned in a matter of seconds and come up with a preliminary report that says, you know, here are the things you need to focus on. And, you know, the future is now, and it's pretty cool. So moving right on to the next thing. And this is kind of the last slide for today here, is, you know, essentially what good supplier relationship management, it should be essentially managing the relationship of the supplier, not the technical stuff of SOC 2s and certificates of insurance and making sure that, you know, you have the latest and greatest update or whatever it is, right? It's making sure that there's an alignment between the stakeholders internally to the company and the supplier itself, in external and internal stakeholders, make sure that everything's aligned. And essentially making sure that you are innovating together, you're collaborating together, and making better decisions, right? It's a very telling sign when procurement is a toothless tiger that checks a bunch of boxes and making sure that all these reviews are getting done. But if you still do the reviews and you get voted off the island if bad things show up, you know, you're probably not all that well suited to sort of move to the next space, the next spot. So with that, you know, happy to get into discussions with you guys about anything that you want to know about supplier management. I myself have built supplier management programs for large financial services and insurance companies. So I'm kind of passionate about it. The thing that you should think about here is if you want to download an assessment to say, is your supplier management organization delivering strategic value? You take a picture of the QR code on the left, and that's a downloadable that you can sort of go ahead and check some boxes and so on, and decide about where you are sitting in the journey. And if you want to register for our next podcast, which is March 18th, you should take a picture of the QR code on the right. Maya, thank you so much for taking care of us today. And Roy makes his apologies for not showing up today. But thanks a lot for all your time, everybody. And we look forward to talking soon.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.